Welcome to this wrap-up session, Target All-Comers Outcome Update, sponsored by Microport. My name is Andreas Baumbach. I'm here with Alexandra Lansky from Yale and William Wijns from Galway in Ireland. What will we see in the next 15 minutes? We will talk about the Firehawk technology, about the 3 years outcome that have been highlighted as a light-breaking trial at this year's PCR. And we will talk about future directions of this clinical trials program. As you know, the new generation drug-eluting stents reduce the rate of repeat revascularization, and there are thoughts that biodegradable polymer DES are believed to be safer than durable polymer DES because of reduced inflammatory reaction. So there is the thought of a long-term benefit. In this session, we discuss the Target clinical program, which assesses the Firehawk DES, which is a novel biodegradable polymer DES. I'll start off talking about the Firehawk technology, which you see illustrated on this slide. You see the typical cell conformation, and then the hallmark is the abluminal growth, which you see on the bottom. Which houses the bioresorbable polymer and a small amount of drug. So the drug only comes in contact with the vessel wall, is targeted delivery, and hence the name of the program Target. The strut size is 86 micrometers, very similar to the 81 we have in the Wijns. And this was actually the comparison in the Target AC trial. On the left, the Firehawk parameters, on the right, the Wijns parameter. Both are cobalt alloy. They have different polymers. One is bioresorbable and one is durable. And they have differences in polymer thickness and, of course, the drug. We did an early study, 3-month outcomes, looking at the healing response to the treatment in both arms. Next. And we're able to confirm that the primary endpoint was non-inferior. There was a similar mean neointimal thickness with 75 and 82 microns in the two arms. Moreover, next, we found that uncovered strut and malapposition in the Firehawk Target OCT arm were 0.1% and 1%, which compares very favorably to other reported numbers in similar stent systems, and of course on the bottom line compares very favorably to the Wijns in this particular trial.
So Andreas, maybe I can ask you a quick question here. When I look at this, it looks to me that the Firehawk has the lowest percentage by far of uncovered strut. So can you put this in context in terms of safety, potentially reduce the DAPT with this platform?
Yes, I think that's what we're hoping. What we hoped for. We're looking at uncovered struts and malapposition as a safety signal. So the less uncovered struts, the less malapposition you have, the less risk we think there is for early and then later stent thrombosis. And we look at the neointimal thickness as a marker, as a proxy, if you wish, for effectiveness. And indeed, the next slide will show us that this did translate into similar and very low target lesion failure rates in the 1-year outcomes of Target AC. And with this, I will actually hand back over to you, Alexandra, to tell us about the new data, the 3 years outcome in this cohort.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. So what you're showing here is non-inferiority at 12 months. But I think you mentioned that the polymer actually disappears at 9 months. So it makes sense that we may not see a differentiation here between these platforms at 12 months. And what I'm going to be presenting here is the 3-year outcome. So we're tracking these patients out longer term to see if there's a difference in outcomes. So just wanted to highlight the trial design of Target All-Comers. This was an open label non-inferiority study, minimal exclusion criteria. We randomized 1,656 patients in 20 European centers. You've spoken about the OCT substudy. The primary endpoint was the traditional target lesion failure at 12 months. I'm going to be talking about the three-year outcomes, but of course, we're going to be following these patients out to 5 years ultimately. On the next slide, I wanted to very high level talk about the trial leadership and the outstanding execution of this study. The steering committee was led by William Wijns. And you can see that there was a number of independent committees, including CEC, DSMB, data management, and 2 core laboratories, including an angiographic core laboratory by our friend and colleague, Professor Zhubo at CCRF in China. So it's truly a global program. Next slide. The patient population and lesion characteristics, I think, is very consistent with what we would expect from an all-comers population. It was well matched. Some key points: the lesion length was about 19 millimeters. There was 1.7 stents implanted per patient. And you can see we included here about 9% STEMI patients, 20% non-STEMI patients, and overall ACS patients were accounted for about 45% of this population. Next slide. So this is the primary endpoint going out to 3 years, and you can see that in fact there were no differences. Overall, at 3 years, you're looking at about a 12% event rate in both groups. So really nothing differentiating these 2 platforms. Next slide. And again, the best way to look at this to see if long-term there's a benefit is to do a landmark analysis. You can see that between 1 and 3 years, these curves are completely superimposable. So essentially, the safety and effectiveness of Firehawk is really comparable to the durable polymeric Wijns B stent. Next slide. We're looking at patient-oriented composite endpoints here again in a landmark analysis. This is a more holistic view of the population, including all death, all MI, and all revascularization, no differences. And then focusing on the safety parameters of definite and probable stent thrombosis. These events are rare, but what is interesting to look at is between 12 months and 3 years, you can see a hazard ratio here of 0.68 favoring the Firehawk. And if you look at the very bottom line, I'm showing you very late stent thrombosis. There were only 6 cases with Firehawk and 11 cases with Wijns, so almost half with Firehawk. So potentially a signal of safety. Of course, these events are infrequent and not enough to be of significance, but I think it certainly gives us a signal. So again, as we move this forward, I think it really does beg the question of reduced DAPT. And I'm going to turn this over to William to discuss our pre-specified DAPT substudy from this trial.
Yes, thank you very much, Alexandra. Any such signal, of course, particularly with respect to stent thrombosis, needs to be looked at along with the dual antiplatelet therapy. So the next slide summarizes the DAPT substudy that we had planned. In quite a large proportion of the total population, nearly 78% of the total group was included in this study, where we looked at target lesion failure over a 2-year period, along with a detailed account of the DAPT treatment that they were on. This subgroup was well balanced in terms of demographics compared to the total group and also within randomization arms. So most patients were prescribed either clopidogrel or ticagrelor. In the middle, you see that in ACS patients, 70% of them were actually receiving the ticagrelor in green. And on the right pie chart, in chronic CAD patients, 75% were actually prescribed clopidogrel. So the next one shows the rate of discontinuation of DAPT. So in the beginning, all the patients were obviously on aspirin plus one of the P2Y12 inhibitors. The graph shows in dotted lines the stable angina patients, and the colors are the same as before, blue for Firehawk and red for Science. So at 180 days there, you see that a good 20% of patients with chronic stable angina discontinued. And then we see another shift there in the DAPT use, that after 1 year, we're only left with about 30% of the population that will continue. So we're particularly interested in the time beyond 9 months, when the polymer is gone with Firehawk and still present permanently with Science. So whatever changes we see, we cannot ascribe them to differences in the DAPT treatment. The next slide shows the main results of that sub-study. So we're looking at target lesion failure and its components on the left before discontinuation, okay, on treatment, and you see there is not much of a difference, while on the right, after discontinuation of the DAPT, we do see an interesting trend in fewer target lesion failures, fewer target vessel mark-out infarction, also fewer ischemia-driven target lesion revascularization in the Firehawk group. Statistically, the numbers are not significant, but there is a very interesting trend here showing that after DAPT discontinuation, when the stent struts are no longer protected by dual antiplatelet therapy, there is actually fewer events with Firehawk than with Science. So to conclude this sub-study in a few words on the next slide, we can state that the 2-year DAPT overall did show similar safety and efficacy, but after discontinuation of DAPT compared to Science with the Firehawk, there was a trend for lesser target vessel MIs and fewer also ischemia-driven TLRs. With these numbers in mind, I hand it over to Andreas, who will wrap up the findings that we've described to you.
Okay, thank you very much, William. So what have we learned in this brief wrap-up session? What are our results? The Firehawk was non-inferior to Science at 12 months. We knew that since the data have been published in the Lancet 2 years ago, but these results are now maintained at 3 years with fewer very late stent thromboses. We learned that in patients who discontinued DAPT, including ACS patients, there's a signal of safety with a trend for lower MI and ischemia-driven target lesion revascularization compared to the Science. Why is this important? I think it is really important to say that the Firehawk is as safe and effective compared to the comparator at 3 years. And excitingly, we might actually see a clinical benefit in the future that is based on the different technology with the bioresorbable polymer as opposed to the durable. Of course, we have to wait for the 5-year results to come out and to show that. But we will continue to look. I will use this slide to thank all the collaborators, thank the team, Shubo and Laura Authentis-Jacques. And I want to highlight the papers that have come out in sequence, and on the lower left you see the publication of the 3 years results that coincide with this late breaking at EuroPCR this year. This is not all. There is more going on. I'll hand back, and also for the final wrap-up, to Alexandra to tell us about the new trials in North America.
So very exciting. Thank you, Andreas. Very exciting is the US IDE trial. This is target 4. You can see here the trial design. I'm not going to go into the details. Very similar, in fact, to target AC. I think same primary endpoint of target lesion failure out to 5 years. I think the exciting thing here is, from the regulatory standpoint, is that they're going to be leveraging target AC in the approval in the United States. So again, I think this is sort of a big step forward in terms of the regulatory pathway, leveraging data from different regions. So with that, we'll be back hopefully in a couple of years with the 5-year outcomes. I'd like to thank both Andreas and William for this very informative session, and I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us today.